The envelope sat on Eleanor Martin's kitchen table for 3 days before she found the courage to open it. It was thick, cream-colored, and bore her name in unfamiliar handwriting. The return address was from a law firm in Portland, Maine, a city she hadn't visited in 23 years. Eleanor was 45, lived alone in her modest Chicago apartment, and had carefully constructed a life that felt, if not completely fulfilling, at least predictable. She taught high school English, loved her students, had a small circle of close friends, and had convinced herself that the occasional loneliness was simply the price of independence. Her life was orderly, controlled, and free from the chaos that had marked her early years. When she finally slid her finger under the envelope's seal, she expected paperwork about a distant relative's estate or perhaps some administrative matter concerning her long-abandoned childhood home. What she didn't expect was to inherit a lighthouse. "Dear Miss Martin," the letter began, "we regret to inform you of the passing of Gloria Whitaker on April 3rd. As per her last will and testament, the property known as Pemaquid Point Lighthouse Keeper's House and its contents are bequeathed to you as her sole heir." Eleanor's hands trembled. Gloria Whitaker, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in decades. Her mother's only sister. The woman who had taken her in at age 12 when her parents' marriage dissolved in a hurricane of addiction and violence, only to send her away to a boarding school after less than a year under her roof. "This can't be right," Eleanor whispered to her empty kitchen. The only sound in response was the hum of her refrigerator. Accompanying the letter was a photograph of a white clapboard house nestled beside a towering lighthouse on a rocky promontory. The Atlantic Ocean crashed against the shore in the background. It looked like something from a postcard, picturesque, remote, and utterly foreign to her urban existence. There were more papers, property deeds, tax documents, and a handwritten note that simply said, "When you're ready to understand, Gloria." Eleanor set the papers down and walked to her window. Chicago sprawled before her, concrete, steel, and glass, a world away from the coastal Maine setting of her brief adolescent interlude. She had spent decades deliberately not thinking about that time, about her aunt, about the strange, silent summer she'd spent in that lighthouse keeper's house before being shipped off to school. What was there to understand? Her aunt had barely known her, had spoken to her perhaps a total of 50 sentences during their time together, had never once reached out in all the years since. And now, this woman had left her a lighthouse. Eleanor called the school to arrange for a substitute, booked a flight to Portland, and began packing without fully understanding why. Something in her aunt's cryptic note had pulled at a thread she'd long tried to ignore. 2 days later, she stood at the base of Pemaquid Point Lighthouse, keys in hand, staring up at the structure that now belonged to her. The April wind whipped her hair around her face, carrying the scent of salt and impending rain. The keeper's house, a 2-story white building with black shutters, sat adjacent to the lighthouse, looking both quaint and forbidding. A man approached her from the small parking lot. He was in his early 50s, with weathered skin and kind eyes. "You must be Eleanor," he said, extending his hand.
"I'm Michael Levitt."
"I was Gloria's friend. I've been looking after the place since she fell ill." Eleanor shook his hand. "I didn't know she was ill. I didn't know anything about her, really." Michael studied her face. "She knew you'd come. Said you had her eyes." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. She'd been told that before, that her eyes were Whitaker eyes, deep blue with a ring of gold around the pupil. It was the only physical trait she shared with her mother and aunt. "Did she say anything else? About why she left this place to me?" Michael glanced toward the lighthouse. "Gloria wasn't one for explaining herself, but she kept your picture on her mantle. The one from your high school graduation." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the April wind. "How did she have that?" "She kept tabs on you. From a distance." He gestured toward the house. "Should we go in? There's coffee, and I imagine you have questions." The keeper's house was surprisingly warm inside, with wide plank floors and windows that caught the afternoon light. The furnishings were simple but elegant: comfortable chairs, well-stocked bookshelves, and paintings of the surrounding coastline. It felt lived and loved. In the living room, Eleanor stopped short. Above the fireplace hung a portrait, a young woman with her dark hair blowing in the wind, standing at the base of the lighthouse. For a moment, she thought it was herself, until she realized the clothing was from another era. "That's Gloria," Michael said, coming up behind her. "Painted in 1975, when she first became keeper." "She was the lighthouse keeper?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "I thought that was just what they called the house." Michael smiled. "One of the last civilian keepers before the Coast Guard automated everything. She stayed on as property caretaker afterward. Never wanted to leave this place." Eleanor studied the portrait. Her aunt looked vibrant, determined, nothing like the stern, silent woman she remembered from her brief stay. "I don't understand why she took me in only to send me away," Eleanor said quietly. Michael gestured for her to sit. "Gloria wasn't good with children, or with people generally. She lived most of her life alone here. But when your mother asked for help." "My mother asked her to take me?" This was news to Eleanor. She'd always assumed the arrangement had been made by social services after her father's arrest. "Your mother knew she couldn't care for you. And Gloria tried in her way. But she quickly realized she didn't know how to raise a traumatized 12-year-old girl. So she got rid of me." The bitterness in Eleanor's voice surprised even her. Michael shook his head. "She believed she was doing what was best for you, giving you an education, stability, things she couldn't provide here." "She could have tried," Eleanor said, looking around at the comfortable home. "This seems like a perfectly fine place to raise a child." "There's more to the story," Michael said, standing. "Gloria left some things for you. In her study upstairs. I think you should see them alone." He showed her to a small room on the second floor with a desk facing the ocean. On it sat a wooden box, a leather-bound journal, and an old photograph album. "I'll make that coffee," Michael said, leaving her alone with her aunt's belongings. Eleanor approached the desk slowly. The wooden box was inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a wave pattern. Inside, she found a collection of sea glass in various colors, arranged by hue, blues, greens, amber, and the rare red pieces. Underneath was a folded piece of paper with her childish handwriting. "Treasures found with Aunt Gloria, summer 1998. She had no memory of collecting these with her aunt. In fact, she had few memories of that summer at all, beyond a pervasive sense of sadness and abandonment. The photograph album was next. The first few pages showed Gloria as a young woman, often alone, or with an elderly couple Eleanor assumed were her grandparents. Then came a shock. A photo of Eleanor herself, standing on the rocks below the lighthouse, her face solemn but her hands proudly displaying a starfish. Another showed her reading in a window seat. Another caught her mid-laugh as waves splashed around her knees. Evidence of a summer she couldn't recall. Moments of apparent joy she'd completely forgotten. The journal was dated September 1998, beginning just after Eleanor had been sent to boarding school. The first entry read, "I sent her away today. The house feels wrong without her footsteps on the stairs. But what do I know about raising a child? I who have chosen solitude over connection at every turn? Eleanor deserves better than a broken woman in a lighthouse. She deserves a chance at normalcy. Still, I find myself listening for her voice calling out when she discovers something on the shore. The silence is punishment for my cowardice." Eleanor closed the journal, her hands shaking. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lighthouse and the vast Atlantic beyond. The sky was darkening with approaching rain, mirroring the storm inside her. She had spent decades believing her aunt hadn't wanted her, hadn't cared. She had built her life on that foundation, being self-sufficient, never needing anyone, never giving anyone the chance to send her away again. And now this journal suggested something entirely different. The rain began to fall as Eleanor opened the journal again, determined to understand the woman who had just complicated her carefully constructed narrative of abandonment. The rain intensified as Eleanor delved deeper into Gloria's journal. Outside, the lighthouse beam began its rhythmic sweeping, automated now but still vigilant. Eleanor found herself absorbed in her aunt's private thoughts, written in a careful slanted hand. October 3, 1998. I received Eleanor's first letter from school today. So formal and polite. Dear Aunt Gloria, thank you for the packages. I am doing well in my classes. Not a trace of the wild girl who chased seagulls and built elaborate sand castles. I've asked the school to send weekly reports. They say she's quiet, studious, and adjusting well. What does that mean? Has she buried herself the way I did after Patrick? I cannot bear to think I've taught her that particular skill. Eleanor paused. Patrick? She had never heard of anyone named Patrick in her aunt's life, and the description of herself as a wild girl seemed to belong to another child entirely. Her memories of that time were hazy. Trauma, her therapist had once suggested, can do that, but she remembered herself as withdrawn, silent, and afraid. She continued reading, flipping through entries that spanned months, then years. Gloria had chronicled her life at the lighthouse, the changing seasons, the storms, the visitors, but woven through it all were references to Eleanor. Packages sent. Report cards received. Graduation announcements saved. May 15, 2004. Eleanor graduates next week. The invitation arrived today, formal, embossed with her school crest. I won't go. I can't. She hasn't responded to my letters in years. Seeing me would only reopen wounds. But I've sent a gift. A necklace with a piece of sea glass we found together. The pale blue one that made her eyes light up. She likely won't remember where it came from. Perhaps that's better. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her throat. The sea glass necklace. She still had it, tucked away in her jewelry box at home. She'd never known who sent it, as it had arrived with only a brief note saying congratulations. She'd worn it to her college graduation, and occasionally on first dates, drawn to its unique color that somehow felt personal. The rain drummed harder against the windows as Eleanor continued through the journal, discovering that Gloria had followed her life from afar. Her college years, her first teaching job, even news clippings of when Eleanor had been featured in the Chicago Tribune for her innovative English program for at-risk teens. November 18, 2017. Eleanor won a teaching award today. The article included a photo. She looks so much like Catherine at that age, but without the shadow of desperation. She's found her lighthouse, those students her beacon. I wonder if she knows how much like me she is, standing guard over lives that need direction. I've never been more certain I made the right choice in letting her go, and never been more haunted by it. Catherine, her mother. Eleanor had few memories of her, mostly fragmented scenes of a woman with the same dark hair and blue-gold eyes, sometimes laughing too loudly, sometimes crying in locked bathrooms, sometimes simply absent. A knock at the study door startled her. Michael stood there with a tray holding a coffee pot and 2 mugs. "Thought you might need this," he said. "It's getting dark." Eleanor realized the room had grown dim as evening approached. She'd been reading for hours. "I don't understand," she said as Michael set down the tray. "These journals. They paint a picture of a woman who cared deeply. But that's not the aunt I remember." Michael poured coffee for them both. Gloria was complicated. Tragedy shaped her early on, and she never quite recovered her ability to connect with people directly. But that doesn't mean she didn't feel things deeply. "What tragedy?" Eleanor asked. Michael hesitated. "That should come from her, not me. Keep reading. There's another journal after that one." He left her alone again, and Eleanor turned to the next volume. This one began in 2020 and continued until just months before Gloria's death. The entries were shorter, the handwriting increasingly shaky, but still deliberate. February 2, 2023. The doctors are using words like progression and palliative. Ridiculous terms that dance around the central fact. I am dying. My concerns are few. The lighthouse will continue its work without me. But Eleanor, I've spent a lifetime watching over her from a distance deemed necessary. Was it? The question plagues my final days. I have written to James Harrison to change my will. The keeper's house should go to her. Perhaps in this place with these views and these journals she might finally understand. If nothing else, she should know she was never unwanted, just protected in the only way I knew how. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. Outside, the lighthouse beam cut through the rainy darkness in steady, reliable pulses. A memory surfaced, previously buried. Sitting on the rocks with the younger Gloria, their hands sticky with melting ice cream, watching the beam begin its nightly rotation. "That's what we do for those we love," Gloria had said quietly. "We shine a light so they can find their way home, even if we're not the home they're seeking." Eleanor hadn't understood then. She wasn't sure she understood now. She continued reading through the final journal, learning of Gloria's diagnosis of ALS, her determination to remain at the lighthouse as long as possible, and her meticulous planning for Eleanor's inheritance. The entries became sparser, more difficult to decipher as the disease progressed. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Gloria's death, reads simply, "The light keeps turning. Remember that, Eleanor, when you find this. Some loves are better expressed from a distance. I hope someday you'll understand why I kept mine on the horizon of your life, a steady beam you could see but never had to acknowledge. The keeper dies, but the light remains." Eleanor closed the journal and wiped her tears. She felt cracked open, as if 23 years of carefully constructed assumptions were being washed away by the rain that now lashed against the windows. She went downstairs to find Michael sitting in the living room, gazing at the portrait of Gloria. "Tell me about Patrick," Eleanor said without preamble. Michael looked up, his expression sad but unsurprised. "So she mentioned him in the journals." "Briefly. She wrote that she wondered if I was burying myself, the way she did after Patrick." "Who was he?"
Michael gæstede for her 2 sit.
Patrick Donahue was Gloria's fiancé. They were to be married in 1974, right before she took the keeper position. He was a marine biologist, brilliant and kind. They were perfect together. Both loved solitude but found in each other a companionship that didn't demand too much. What happened to him? There was a storm much worse than this one. Patrick went out in his research boat to secure equipment at his study site in the bay. The boat capsized. They found his body 3 days later. Eleanor felt a chill. And Gloria? She turned inward, took the keeper job that had been offered to them as a couple, dedicated herself to the lighthouse and withdrew from nearly everyone. For 20 years she spoke only when necessary, lived alone, kept her grief private. She became known locally as the ghost of Pemaquid Point. Always present but somehow not quite there. Until your mother called in 1998. Catherine was in trouble. Your father had become violent, she was using again, and she was terrified for your safety. She begged Gloria to take you, just until she could get clean and leave him. Eleanor stared into her coffee cup. But she never did.
No.
She overdosed 6 months after you came here. Gloria had to tell you your mother was gone, and a week later the police arrested your father. Gloria was suddenly your only family, your permanent guardian, and she was terrified. So she sent me away. Eleanor couldn't keep the edge from her voice. She was convinced she would damage you, Michael said gently. She believed her solitude was a chosen isolation. She didn't think she could provide what a traumatized child needed: stability, normalcy, social connections. She believed a boarding school could give you a fresh start, away from the shadows of both your parents' mistakes and her own emotional unavailability. She could have asked me what I needed. Yes, Michael agreed. She could have. But Gloria didn't know how to have those conversations. She did what she thought was right, not what was easy. Eleanor stood and walked to the window. The rain had stopped and the night was clearing. The lighthouse beam swept over the dark water in its steady rhythm. "There's something else," Michael said, joining her at the window. "Something she wanted you to have when you were ready." He handed her a small wooden box, similar to the one that had contained the sea glass but smaller. Inside was a key. "It's to the lighthouse," Michael explained. "Gloria arranged special permission for you to access it any time. There's something at the top she wanted you to see." Eleanor closed her hand around the key. "Tonight, if you feel ready." She nodded and Michael led her outside. The air was fresh after the rain, filled with the scent of wet earth and salt. They crossed to the lighthouse, its white tower gleaming in the moonlight that now broke through dispersing clouds. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Eleanor stepped inside to face a spiral staircase winding upward. "I'll wait here," Michael said. "Take your time." The climb was long, the steps narrow and worn smooth by decades of keepers. When Eleanor reached the top, she found herself in the lantern room, surrounded by glass and the massive Fresnel lens that projected the light out to sea. The view was breathtaking. Dark ocean stretching to the horizon, moonlight creating a silver path across the water. On a small shelf built into the wall was a weathered wooden box. Inside, Eleanor found a stack of letters, her letters sent from boarding school, then college, then her adult life. Letters she'd written out of obligation at first, then finally stopped sending when there was never any response beyond the occasional package or card. Except there had been responses. Dozens of them, all unsent, all addressed to her in Gloria's handwriting. Eleanor sank to the floor of the lantern room and began to read. The first letter was dated September 15, 1998, just days after Eleanor had been sent to boarding school. My dearest Eleanor, you've been gone 1 week, and I've started this letter 17 times. The words never seem right. How do I explain to a 12-year-old girl that I've sent her away not because I don't want her, but because I'm afraid of failing her? That I look at you and see both your mother's fragility and your own fierce heart, and I'm terrified of breaking both? You asked me the night before you left if you'd done something wrong. The question haunts me. No, sweet girl. You've done nothing wrong. It is I who am wrong to think I could suddenly transform from a solitary lighthouse keeper into someone equipped to guide a young life through its storms. Your school reports you're doing well. I hope that's true and not just what you want them to see. You're good at hiding, Eleanor. I recognized it immediately because I've spent decades perfecting the same skill. I won't send this letter. What good would it do? Better you build your new life without the weight of my inadequacies. With love I cannot properly express, Gloria. Eleanor wiped tears from her cheeks and opened another letter, this one from her high school years. Dear Eleanor, your latest report card arrived yesterday. Straight A's again, and a note from your English teacher about your exceptional essay on Jane Eyre. She writes that your analysis of isolation as both prison and protection was remarkably insightful. I smiled when I read that. You understand more than they know. I wonder if you still write poetry as you did that summer here. You would hide them, those poems, but I found one once, tucked between the pages of a tide chart. The lighthouse doesn't save everyone, you wrote. Just those who know to look for its light. 12 years old with such wisdom already. I saw your mother in you that summer, her creativity, her sensitivity, but without her fatal flaw, the belief that love should consume rather than sustain. Catherine always sought the kind of love that burned. It destroyed her in the end. I worry sometimes that in trying to protect you from her fate, I've pushed you toward my own too solitary, too guarded. I won't send this either. You're 16 now, building your own life. My sudden intrusion of explanations would only disrupt whatever peace you've made with our shared past. I shine my light toward you, even if you don't see it. Gloria. The lighthouse beam swung around, momentarily flooding the small room with brilliance before continuing its steady rotation. Eleanor read letter after letter, tracking her life through her aunt's unsent correspondence. There were letters celebrating her college acceptance, worrying over her first heartbreak, how had Gloria even known about that? And expressing quiet pride in her choice to become a teacher. One letter, written when Eleanor was in her 30s and established in her career, struck particularly deep. My dear Eleanor, I saw your name in the Education Journal today. Eleanor Martin develops program for students recovering from trauma. The article mentioned how you create safe harbors for these children, places where they can speak their truth without judgment, or can simply be silent if that's what they need. You've become a different kind of lighthouse keeper, Eleanor. You stand guard over young lives just as surely as I've watched over ships. But you've done what I never could. You've opened the door and invited them in from the storm. I wonder sometimes what might have happened if I'd found the courage to keep you here, to learn alongside you how to bridge the distance between two wounded souls. Would you be different? Would I? It's a useless question at this point, but one that visits me on nights when the fog is thick and the beam seems to disappear into nothingness. Your mother once told me I was incapable of real love because real love requires risk. You can't love from behind glass, Gloria, she said. Maybe she was right. I've spent my life loving from a distance, Patrick's memory, your progress in the world. Safe harbors for my heart. But know this, though I'll never send these words. I have loved you imperfectly but completely from the moment Catherine placed you in my arms and said, "She's the best of me. Don't let her become the rest of me." Perhaps someday when I'm gone and these letters find you, you'll understand that sometimes love looks like letting go. Always, Gloria. Eleanor carefully refolded the letter, her vision blurred with tears. Outside, the night had cleared completely, stars now visible between passing clouds. The lighthouse beam swept over the water in its perfect rhythm, unwavering. She thought about her own life, her careful independence, her tendency to keep even close friends at a certain emotional distance. She'd always attributed these traits to her early abandonment, But now she wondered if they were also inherited. A Whitaker woman's response to loving and losing. The final letter in the box was dated just a month before Gloria's death. My Eleanor, the disease progresses. Soon I will no longer be able to hold a pen, and these one-sided conversations will end. Michael tells me I should have these letters delivered to you now, that I should finally break my silence. But I cannot bear to disrupt your life with my deathbed confessions. Instead, I've arranged for you to receive this lighthouse after I'm gone. Perhaps it's selfish. One final attempt to bring you back to the place where, for one brief summer, we almost found a way to reach each other. Do you remember the day we found the heart-shaped sea glass? You held it up to the sun and said, "It's the same color as our eyes." Our eyes. The first time you'd acknowledged our connection so directly. I should have grabbed that moment, Eleanor. Should have pulled you close and promised you weren't alone. Instead, I simply nodded and let another opportunity drift away like tide-taken sand. The doctors say I have perhaps a month. Not long enough to correct a lifetime of silence, but perhaps long enough to ensure you'll know, eventually, that you were always loved, always wanted, always seen, even from a distance. The lighthouse is yours now. Sell it if you wish. I've made arrangements so that's possible despite its historical status. Or keep it as a retreat from your busy life. Either way, know that it has been my honor to keep watch here. Over ships at sea and over you, my heart's true north. With all the love I never properly expressed, Gloria. Eleanor sat with the letter in her hands for a long time, listening to the rhythm of the waves below, and feeling the gentle vibration of the lighthouse, as it continued its centuries-old purpose. She thought about Gloria, alone in this tower for decades, keeping ships safe while watching Eleanor's life from afar. She thought about her own life, successful by conventional standards, but marked by a persistent loneliness she'd always attributed to her childhood losses. How many connections had she avoided? How many people had she kept at arm's length, fearing abandonment that might never have come? The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when Eleanor finally descended the spiral staircase, the box of letters tucked under her arm. Michael was no longer waiting at the bottom. A note on the door informed her he'd gone home, but would check on her tomorrow. Eleanor walked back to the keeper's house alone, watching as the first hint of dawn touched the Atlantic. Inside, she moved through the rooms with new awareness, noticing details she'd missed earlier. Framed articles about Eleanor's teaching career on a bookshelf, a photograph of Gloria and a dark-haired man, Patrick presumably, tucked beside the reading chair. A collection of shells arranged on the kitchen windowsill that Eleanor suddenly remembered gathering herself as a child. She made coffee and carried it to the porch that faced the ocean. As the sun rose, casting golden light across the water, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a wall crumbling, a tide turning. Her aunt had loved her, imperfectly but genuinely, had watched over her from afar, a steady presence Eleanor had never recognized. The realization didn't erase the pain of their separation, but it reframed it in a light that made room for understanding and perhaps, eventually, forgiveness. Eleanor spent the day exploring the keeper's house and grounds, reclaiming fragments of memory with each discovery. The window seat where she'd read for hours during summer rain showers. The tidal pool where Gloria had taught her about marine ecosystems. The kitchen table where they'd sorted sea glass by color and opacity. By evening, she'd begun to piece together a different narrative of that long-ago summer. Not the story of abandonment she'd carried for decades, but something more nuanced. A story of two wounded people attempting connection despite lacking the tools to bridge their mutual isolation. As night fell, Eleanor found herself drawn back to the lighthouse. She climbed the spiral stairs again, this time continuing past the lantern room, to the small outdoor platform that circled the top of the tower. The wind was stronger here, whipping her hair around her face as she looked out over the darkening ocean. Below the keeper's house, her house now, glowed with warm light. Beyond it stretched the Atlantic, vast and mysterious in the gathering darkness. Eleanor thought about Gloria, about her mother Catherine, about the Whitaker women, and their different responses to pain. Catherine had sought oblivion, Gloria isolation. And Eleanor had built walls disguised as independence. The lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation, cutting through the darkness with unwavering purpose. Eleanor watched it sweep across the water and understood, finally, what Gloria had tried to tell her that long ago summer day. That's what we do for those we love. We shine a light so they can find their way home, even if we're not the home they're seeking. Eleanor had intended to stay at Pemaquid Point for just a week, long enough to sort through Gloria's belongings and make arrangements for the property. But 1 week turned into 2, then a month. She extended her leave of absence from the Chicago school, telling herself she needed time to decide what to do with her unexpected inheritance. The truth was more complicated. With each passing day, she felt more connected to this place, and to the aunt she was only now beginning to understand through journals, letters, and recovered memories. May arrived, bringing warmer days and the first tourists to the lighthouse. Eleanor found herself greeting them, answering questions about the historic structure, even occasionally giving impromptu tours of the grounds. She discovered she enjoyed sharing the lighthouse's history, and by extension, her own newly discovered heritage. Michael checked on her frequently, bringing groceries and local gossip, gradually filling in the gaps in Gloria's story. Eleanor learned that after Patrick's death, Gloria had indeed become almost hermit-like, speaking little and avoiding the nearby town. But over decades, she had slowly developed her own particular way of connecting, not through words, but through presence and small kindnesses. Weather forecasts left in fishermen's mailboxes before storms, anonymous donations to the local school, sea glass jewelry created and sold at the community craft fair, with proceeds going to the Maritime Museum. She wasn't as isolated as she believed, Michael explained one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Just connected in her own way. Like her letters to me, Eleanor said quietly. One-sided conversations that still somehow mattered. It was during the 3rd week of May that the first unusual visitor arrived. Eleanor was in the garden behind the keeper's house, attempting to salvage what remained of Gloria's herb plants, when a shadow fell across the soil. You must be Eleanor. She looked up to find an elderly man leaning on a walking stick, studying her with bright eyes that seemed familiar somehow. I am, she acknowledged, getting to her feet and brushing soil from her hands. Can I help you? I'm Robert Whitaker, your grandfather's brother. Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. She'd never met any of her Whitaker relatives beyond Gloria. I didn't know you existed, she said finally. The old man chuckled. Gloria wouldn't have mentioned me. We had a falling out decades ago, after your grandfather died. Stupid family disagreement that hardened into permanent estrangement. But when I heard she'd passed, and that Catherine's daughter had inherited the lighthouse, he shrugged. Seemed time to mend fences, even if Gloria isn't here to see it. Eleanor invited him in for tea, and for the next 2 hours, she listened as Robert filled in pieces of the Whitaker family history she'd never known. Her grandfather's career as a maritime lawyer, her grandmother's mental health struggles, the family's deep connection to the Maine coast going back generations. Your mother was the family rebel, Robert said, his expression softening. Brilliant but restless. She rejected everything about this place, this life. Wanted city lights and excitement. Gloria was the opposite, steady, reliable, happiest in solitude. And yet Gloria took me in when my mother couldn't cope, Eleanor said. Robert nodded. The Whitaker women have their differences, but they share one trait: fierce loyalty to family, even when it costs them. He looked around the keeper's house. So what will you do with this place? Gloria refused all offers to sell during her lifetime, but developers would pay handsomely for this location. The question caught Eleanor off guard. She hadn't seriously considered selling, though she knew it was the practical option. Her life was in Chicago. Her job, her friends, her carefully constructed routine. I'm not sure yet, she answered honestly. Robert nodded as if he'd expected this answer. The lighthouse has a way of claiming Whitakers. We're either drawn to it completely or run from it entirely. He glanced at her with those familiar eyes, the same blue gold as her own. I wonder which you'll be. After Robert left, promising to return with family photographs, Eleanor walked the perimeter of the property, thinking about belonging, about inheritance, both physical and emotional. The next unexpected visitor arrived 3 days later. Eleanor was organizing Gloria's extensive collection of marine biology books when a knock came at the door. Opening it, she found a young woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, with a backpack and nervous expression. "Hi," the young woman said, shifting from foot to foot. "I'm Lily Chen. I'm doing my graduate thesis on lighthouse keepers' personal accounts. I had been corresponding with Gloria Whitaker before her. Before she passed away, she had agreed to let me see her journals." Eleanor hesitated. Gloria's journals felt intensely private, especially now that Eleanor understood how much of herself her aunt had hidden from the world. Seeing her hesitation, Lily quickly added, "Only the lighthouse logs, of course. The official records she kept about weather conditions, ships passing, maintenance issues. She mentioned she had decades of those." "Oh," Eleanor said, relieved. "Yes, those would be different from her personal journals." "I can come back another time if this isn't convenient," Lily offered. But Eleanor found herself inviting the young researcher in. There was something appealing about her genuine enthusiasm for maritime history. Besides, the idea of sharing Gloria's professional legacy felt right somehow. Together, they located the lighthouse logs in Gloria's study, dozens of bound volumes documenting daily observations from her years as keeper. Lily handled them with reverence, explaining that such continuous records from a single keeper were increasingly rare and valuable to researchers studying climate change, shipping patterns, and local marine ecology. "Your aunt was meticulous," Lily said admiringly, as they looked through the earliest volume from 1974. Most keepers recorded just the minimum required information, but she documented everything: bird migrations, unusual marine life sightings, even the changing patterns of coastal erosion. "She was a scientist at heart," Eleanor said, remembering the careful way Gloria had taught her to identify shellfish and seabirds during that long-ago summer. Another memory surfaced, Gloria patiently explaining how the lighthouse lens worked, how the prisms bent light to create a beam visible for miles at sea. She hoped to publish her observations someday, Eleanor said, realizing as she spoke that this might be true. "I think the research was a connection to Patrick, her fiancé. He was a marine biologist." Lily nodded. "She mentioned him in our correspondence. Said his work on intertidal ecosystems was decades ahead of its time." She looked up from the log she was examining. "I could help you organize these if you'd like. They really should be preserved properly, maybe even digitized for researchers." Eleanor found herself agreeing to Lily's proposal. The young woman's enthusiasm was infectious, and the idea of preserving Gloria's work, making it accessible to others, felt like a fitting tribute. Lily began coming to the lighthouse 3 times a week, carefully cataloging and digitizing the logs, while sharing stories of other lighthouse keepers she'd researched. Through Lily's eyes, Eleanor began to see Gloria not as an isolated, emotionally distant figure, but as part of a proud tradition of men and women who had dedicated their lives to keeping others safe. "They were all a bit peculiar," Lily said one afternoon as they worked. "You'd have to be, to choose this life. But they were also uncommonly dedicated. Your aunt was legendary among lighthouse historians for refusing to leave during the blizzard of '78. Even when the Coast Guard ordered an evacuation." Eleanor looked up from the photograph album she was organizing. "I didn't know that." "Oh yes," Lily said, warming to her topic. "The power went out, so she operated the light manually for 36 hours straight. Saved a fishing vessel that had lost navigation. The captain brings flowers to the lighthouse every year on the anniversary." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. When Eleanor answered, she found a weathered man in his 60s, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. "Is Gloria around?" he asked, then, noting Eleanor's expression, quickly added, "I'm John Harmon. I bring these every year too." He stopped, understanding dawning. "She's passed, hasn't she?" Eleanor nodded. "I'm her niece, Eleanor." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly, offering the flowers. "Your aunt saved my life and my crew's. If she hadn't kept that light going during the storm." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "Well, I won't keep you. Just wanted to pay my respects as I do every year." Eleanor invited him in, and another piece of Gloria's life came into focus as John recounted the harrowing night his ship nearly crashed on the rocks before Gloria's light guided them to safety. Over the following weeks, more visitors appeared. Former colleagues from the Coast Guard, local artists who had painted the lighthouse over the years, and fishermen who spoke of Gloria's weather predictions with something approaching reverence. She could read the sky better than any meteorologist, one old lobsterman told Eleanor. Left notes in our mailboxes when a big blow was coming, even when the forecast said clear. She was never wrong. Each visitor brought a different perspective on Gloria, helping Eleanor construct a more complete picture of her aunt. Not the cold, distant woman of her childhood memories, but a complex person who had found her own ways to care for others without ever quite overcoming her innate reserve. By June, Eleanor had settled into a routine at the lighthouse. Mornings were spent working remotely for her Chicago school, preparing curriculum for the following year. Afternoons were dedicated to Gloria's archives and the steady stream of visitors. Evenings belonged to the lighthouse itself, watching the automated beam begin its nightly vigil, reading Gloria's journals, and increasingly, writing her own thoughts in a new journal. She had extended her leave through the summer, telling herself she needed time to decide what to do with the property, but increasingly aware that she was reluctant to leave. Something about Pemaquid Point was healing a wound she hadn't fully acknowledged. It was on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, that the most unexpected visitor arrived. Eleanor was sitting on the rocky shore below the lighthouse, watching the sunset paint the Atlantic gold and crimson, when she noticed a man approaching along the water's edge. There was something familiar about his tall, lean figure, the way he moved with careful deliberation. As he drew closer, recognition hit her with physical force. David Martin, her father. Eleanor had not seen him since his arrest when she was 12. He had served 8 years in prison for the assault that had finally prompted her mother to send Eleanor to Gloria. After his release, he had made no attempt to contact her. Now he stood before her, his hair gray, his once handsome face lined and weathered. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I wasn't sure you'd still be here." She stood, heart pounding. "How did you know I was here at all?" "Robert Whitaker. He found me in Portland, told me about Gloria." He hesitated. "I wanted to pay my respects. She did what neither of your parents could, kept you safe." Eleanor felt dizzy with conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, a child's instinctive longing for a parent's love, an adult's hard-earned wariness. "Why now?" she asked. "It's been 27 years. David looked out at the horizon. "I've been sober 14 years. Started making amends where I could. Catherine was gone. You were established in your life, a teacher. Respected. I thought my presence would only disrupt that." He paused. "But when I heard you were here at the lighthouse, I thought maybe it was time. If you want me to go, I will. No questions asked." Eleanor studied him, searching for the volatile man of her childhood in this subdued, aging figure. "Did you ever try to find me before this?" "Once," he admitted. "About 10 years ago. I went to Chicago, saw you teaching a class through the window. You looked happy, confident. I knew then that you'd made a good life without me, and I didn't want to complicate that." The admission that he had watched her from afar, just as Gloria had, struck a chord. Eleanor recognized the pattern. Whitakers and Martins alike, keeping their distance out of some misguided notion of protection. "Would you like to see the lighthouse?" she asked finally. His relief was palpable. "I would." They walked up the path in silence. At the keeper's house, Eleanor made coffee, and they sat on the porch as the last light faded from the sky. "Gloria wrote to me once," David said suddenly. "After I got out of prison, she said she'd ensure I never found you, that you deserved better than what Catherine and I had given you." Eleanor wasn't surprised. She was fiercely protective. David nodded. "She was right. You did deserve better." He looked at her directly. "I don't expect forgiveness, Eleanor, or a relationship. I just wanted you to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted what I did to our family. The man I was then, violent, drunk, consumed by my own pain. He's not who I am now, but that doesn't undo the damage." Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness exactly, but a willingness to see her father as he was now, not as the monster of her childhood memories. "Tell me about your life," she said. For the next 2 hours they talked, carefully at first, then with increasing ease. David told her about his years in prison, his recovery, his work as a carpenter's apprentice, and eventually a restoration specialist for historic buildings. Eleanor shared stories of her teaching career, her students, her life in Chicago. When he rose to leave, the moon was high, casting silver light over the water. "Thank you," he said simply, "for hearing me out. Will you come back?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with the question. "If you'd like," he answered. "I'm working on a restoration project in Portland all summer." Eleanor nodded. "I'd like to hear more about your work. Maybe next week." As she watched him walk away, Eleanor felt a weight lift. Not the full burden of her past, but a portion of it. Enough to make breathing easier. Inside, she took out her journal and wrote, "I've spent my life running from abandonment, only to discover I may have been the one doing the abandoning. Of possibilities, of connections, of the chance to understand my own history. Gloria kept her distance out of fear of failing me. My father stayed away believing his presence would only hurt me. And I built a life defined by its careful boundaries, keeping everyone at arm's length. But the lighthouse doesn't keep ships away from the shore. It guides them safely home. Perhaps it's time I learned to do the same." July brought heat and humidity, along with increasing pressure for Eleanor to make a decision about the lighthouse property. Her school in Chicago needed to know if she would return for the fall semester. The Historical Society had offered to purchase the keeper's house if Eleanor decided not to keep it. David had tentatively suggested she might consider selling to him. He had saved enough over the years to restore and maintain the property. "I'd keep it as Gloria did," he'd said during one of his now regular visits. A working lighthouse, open to the public, preserving the history. The option was tempting in some ways. It would allow Eleanor to return to her established life, while knowing the lighthouse was in caring hands. Yet something held her back from committing to any path. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching lightning flicker over the distant water, Lily joined her, taking a break from her cataloging work. "I finished the logs from 1985 today," the young researcher said, accepting the glass of lemonade Eleanor offered. "Found something interesting, a gap in the entries from September through November. The only break in nearly 50 years of daily records." Eleanor frowned. "That's odd. Gloria was meticulous." Lily nodded. "I thought so too." The entry when she resumed writing simply says, "The light continues its watch, as must I." The enigmatic statement nagged at Eleanor. Later that night, she retrieved Gloria's personal journals from the period, searching for an explanation for the missing lighthouse logs. The answer came in a journal entry dated September 3, 1985. "The Coast Guard has automated the light. After today, they will monitor it remotely. My services as keeper are no longer required, though they've generously offered to let me stay on as caretaker of the property. The last civilian lighthouse keeper in Maine, they called me. A relic, like the hand-cranked foghorn they removed last spring. I should be relieved. The technology is more reliable than human vigilance. No more all-night watches during storms. No more climbing the tower in freezing conditions to clear ice from the lens. But I feel as though I've lost my purpose, the one thing I've done right since Patrick died. I've decided to take a leave. 3 months to determine if there's anything left of Gloria Whitaker separate from the keeper of Pemaquid Point Light." The next day's entry was dated from a cabin in the White Mountains. Gloria had indeed left the lighthouse, seeking to understand who she was beyond her role as keeper. Eleanor read through the journey entries, following Gloria's 3-month pilgrimage through the mountains of New Hampshire, the small towns of Vermont, and finally to the coast of Massachusetts, where Patrick had grown up. The final entry before Gloria's return to Pemaquid Point was revealing. "I came seeking Gloria apart from the lighthouse, only to discover there is no meaningful separation. The lighthouse did not define me. I defined myself through my commitment to it. It was never about the building or the light itself, but about what it represents. Constancy, purpose, the willingness to stand watch so others might find safe passage. I will return to Pemaquid Point tomorrow, no longer the official keeper, but carrying the keeper's heart. The technology may operate the light, but someone must still watch over the human element. The history, the stories, the connection between land and sea. That someone will be me, for as long as I'm able." Eleanor closed the journal, struck by the parallels to her own situation. She had come to the lighthouse seeking Gloria, only to find herself questioning her own carefully constructed identity. The next morning brought a fierce summer storm. Eleanor had planned to visit the Maritime Museum with Lily, but the driving rain made them postpone. Instead, they sat in Gloria's study, drinking tea and watching lightning flash over the darkened water. "I visited a lighthouse in California last year," Lily said, breaking a comfortable silence. "The keeper there told me something I've never forgotten. He said lighthouses aren't about illuminating the whole ocean, an impossible task. They're about lighting one small section of coastline well enough that ships can navigate safely past it." He said it was a good metaphor for life. Eleanor considered this, focusing on what's within your beam. "Exactly." Lily smiled. "Your aunt understood that, I think. She didn't try to save everyone or fix everything. She just kept her light burning consistently for those who needed it." The storm intensified as they talked, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the eaves. By mid-afternoon, the power went out. Not uncommon during coastal storms, but inconvenient. "The lighthouse," Eleanor said suddenly, remembering something Michael had mentioned. "The automated system has a backup generator, but sometimes it needs to be manually activated during outages." Without waiting for Lily's response, she grabbed raincoats for them both and headed out into the storm. The 100-yard walk to the lighthouse felt like miles as they fought against the driving rain and wind. Inside the tower, Eleanor found the backup system Michael had described, but despite her attempts to activate it, the generator remained silent. "The Coast Guard will handle it," Lily shouted over the storm. "It's their responsibility now." But Eleanor thought of Gloria operating the light manually during the blizzard of '78, of Captain Harmon's ship finding safe passage because of that unwavering beam. "There's a hand crank system," she said, already climbing the spiral stairs. "Gloria showed me once years ago." At the top of the lighthouse in the lantern room, Eleanor found the manual override, a system rarely used but maintained for emergencies. With Lily's help, she engaged the mechanical apparatus that would keep the light turning until power was restored. "Now we wait," Eleanor said, settling onto the small bench built into the curve of the lantern room wall. The storm raged around them, rain beating against the glass panels, wind making the entire structure sway slightly. But inside, watching the beam sweep out over the angry sea, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace, of rightness. Hours passed. Lily dozed against the wall while Eleanor maintained the light, making small adjustments when needed. As darkness fell and the storm finally began to ease, Eleanor stood at the window, watching the lighthouse beam cut through the remaining rain. In that moment, she knew what she would do. The next morning, Eleanor made 3 phone calls. One to her school in Chicago, resigning her position. One to a real estate agent to list her Chicago apartment. And one to a local contractor about renovating the keeper's house to include a small educational center. When she told Lily her decision over breakfast, the young researcher beamed. "You're staying." "I'm staying," Eleanor confirmed. "This place, it's more than an inheritance. It's where I belong." The decision, once made, felt inevitable. The lighthouse was part of her heritage, yes, but more than that, it represented the kind of life she suddenly realized she wanted. One with purpose, connection to history, and the opportunity to guide others. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into creating a new life at Pemaquid Point. She worked with the Historical Society to establish formal tours of the lighthouse. She collaborated with Lily to develop educational materials about the maritime history of the region. She reached out to local schools about field trip opportunities. The keeper's house underwent a careful renovation, preserving its historical character while creating space for small exhibits and educational programs. Eleanor moved permanently into Gloria's former bedroom, with its view of the ocean and the lighthouse. Her father, David, became an unexpected ally in the restoration work, offering his expertise in historical preservation. Their relationship developed slowly, fragile but healing, as they worked side by side on the property. Robert Whitaker introduced her to other family members, cousins she'd never known existed, each with stories of the lighthouse and the Whitaker legacy of maritime involvement. Eleanor began piecing together her own history through these connections, understanding both her mother's rebellious flight and Gloria's steadfast commitment in a broader context. By late August, as Lily prepared to return to graduate school, the Lighthouse Educational Center was ready for its soft opening. Local residents, fishermen, Coast Guard personnel, and tourists gathered for the small ceremony. Eleanor, standing on the porch of the keeper's house, looked out at the faces before her. Friends now, not just visitors. Michael with his kind eyes, David standing somewhat apart but present, Robert with his Whitaker pride, Captain Harmon and his crew, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Gloria and the lighthouse she had tended. Lighthouses, Eleanor began, serve a dual purpose. They warn of danger, yes, marking hazardous coastlines and shoals, but they also guide travelers home. For almost 50 years, my Aunt Gloria Whitaker kept this light, officially and then unofficially. She understood that some forms of guidance are subtle, a presence rather than a voice, a steady beam rather than a dramatic rescue. She paused, looking up at the white tower gleaming in the August sunshine. In her memory, this lighthouse will continue its dual purpose, warning of the dangers of forgetting our history and guiding new generations to a deeper understanding of our maritime heritage and the people who maintain these beacons. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Eleanor climbed the lighthouse steps once more. At the top, she looked out over the Atlantic, its surface glittering in the late summer light. She thought of Gloria, of Patrick, of her mother Catherine, of her father David, each navigating their lives as best they could, sometimes losing their way, sometimes finding unexpected harbors. Eleanor opened the small wooden box she'd brought with her, the one containing the sea glass she and Gloria had collected that long ago summer. She selected a piece, pale blue, smoothed by decades of tides, and placed it on the small shelf where Gloria had kept her unsent letters. "I understand now," she said softly to the empty lantern room, knowing somehow that her words would reach across whatever space separated her from her aunt. "The light keeps turning. Some loves are better expressed from a distance, but that doesn't make them any less real." That evening, as darkness fell, Eleanor stood on the porch of the keeper's house, watching the automatic mechanism activate the lighthouse beam. Its steady rhythm swept across the water, a constant amidst change, a guide for those seeking safe passage. She thought about the life she had left behind in Chicago, orderly, predictable, safe, and the new life she was building here, complex, challenging, deeply connected to both past and future. In her hand, she held the key to the lighthouse, worn smooth by generations of keepers. Tomorrow, she would begin training volunteers to give tours, start cataloging Gloria's extensive records for historians, continue the careful restoration of the property. But tonight, she simply watched the light turn, feeling for the first time in years that she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the space between echoes, where the past speaks to the present, and the light keeps turning, guiding ships at sea and lost souls alike safely home.